and good morning, and thank you all for being here. I especially want to thank our nonprofits and our leaders in local law enforcement that are joining me today for their time, as well as for the strong partnerships that we share. We're here today to talk about our collective efforts to end domestic violence in the state of Nevada, particularly here in Las Vegas. While we're heartened by all of the good work we've achieved through work of victim service providers and the men and women in law enforcement over the last many years, the truth is that in Nevada, we have a steep hill to climb with respect to domestic violence. Consistently, the state ranks high among other states when compared to other states for domestic violence rates, particularly domestic violence fatalities, such as when a woman is killed by her domestic partner. During the pandemic, that's been especially true. In April, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department saw an increase in the calls for service by 13%. If you look at shelters in May and June, the number of victims in shelters nearly doubled compared to that time last year. The murder rate in Southern Nevada is driven by domestic violence homicides, murders. 26%, over a quarter of all murders are domestic violence related in the last 6 months. Those statistics are sobering, but what's really heartbreaking is the pain and the real life devastation that domestic violence can cause to our families and other Nevadans, especially when a gun is involved. Here today is Rose Floyd. In 2015, Rose's daughter, Veronica, was shot and killed by her boyfriend, by her husband. And she was it wasn't just Rose Floyd's daughter, Veronica, that was killed. Veronica's husband also killed Rose Floyd's granddaughter and namesake, Yvonne Rose, as well as Yvonne's boyfriend, Corey. And then he took his own life. And following that death, Rose sprung into action and tried to change Nevada law, AB 57. And through that law, she tried to change the victim notification with respect to survivors, family members of domestic violence, fatalities. In 2017, that law was unanimously passed by the Senate and the Assembly in the state of Nevada and was signed into law. Rose's personal tragedy shows how important the work of prevention and intervention that nonprofits do every single day in our community. That's why, in honor of Veronica and every other victim of domestic violence in Nevada, I'm honored and privileged to announce $7 million worth of funding from the Department of Justice. That funding is targeted to state, local, and tribal governments throughout Nevada, here in Las Vegas. Included in that funding are victim service providers like Safeness that you're going to hear from today. They will use this money to enhance their efforts at victim-centered treatments and approaches to domestic violence. These awards are launched today as Project Veronica. In honor of Rose's daughter, so that law enforcement and victim service providers can keep her name in our hearts as we do good work on behalf of victims of domestic violence and we hold abusers accountable. Before getting into the specifics of the grant funds, I want to talk about what the Violent Crime Section of the U.S. Attorney's Office does day in and day out to contribute to curbing domestic violence in Nevada, and how this funding is going to enhance our efforts. Historically, our office has had a healthy mix of gun prosecutions, felons in possession. And through this initiative, we have been, over the last many months, intaking a greater percentage of gun cases that are based on the offender's status as a domestic abuser. And I've left 2 criminal complaints in the back of the room. They're public, and they discuss the type of prosecutions that we're pursuing and prioritizing, including one where a victim was shot and then charged federally, and another where a gun was pulled from a domestic disturbance by Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. The first one I mentioned was in partnership with the ATF and Henderson Police Department. Over the last year or so, we've charged 30 of these type of cases in our office. And the important part of this, in these cases, show the importance of partnerships with our state and locals. We couldn't do this work without North Las Vegas, Henderson Police Departments, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, and of course, Steve Wolfson's office, the Clark County DA's office. We meet regularly every single week to discuss gun cases, and our office, along with Steve's office, discuss which is the best jurisdiction for various gun cases. And I'm proud of that partnership. And DA Wolfson and Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Assistant Chief Chris Darcy are going to talk a little bit about that partnership and this initiative later today in just a few moments. In addition to this initiative, there's another $6 million of grant funds, totaling $7 million of grant funds that go to various nonprofits and state agencies. And since some of those nonprofits and agencies are not able to be here today, I want to highlight a few of them. They're also highlighted in our press release, which is in the back of the room. $1 million to tribal communities for domestic violence prevention. Rural Nevada will benefit to the tune of $1 million, including having special victims response teams. And then there's a $1.5 million grant to the National Council of Juvenile and Family Courts. That's going to build capacity with respect to training and prevention of domestic violence in our state. I want to thank you all for coming again, and I want to hand this over to Attorney General Aaron Ford. Thank you.
Thank you again, U.S. Attorney Nick Trutanich. I am pleased to be here today, and I want to say to you again that I appreciate our partnership. This is a very good opportunity for us to continue working together, and I'm looking forward to being a part of Veronica's project. You know, during my time at the legislature, it was, there was an interesting bit of testimony that came out in 2017, and I was honored to be an integral part of our state's lawmaking process during that time. And I'm honored to have voted in favor of Veronica's law. And it passed unanimously, as Nick indicated. I recall hearing that the testimony during that time left no eye dry. No legislator in that room had a dry eye as you, Ms. Floyd, talked about your loss and the long-standing effects that it's had on your life. You gave each of us a sense of why this law matters, and you are to be congratulated for making a lasting difference in the lives of many Nevada mothers and members of our community. I offer you condolences, but also accommodation, and I want to say thank you so much for your work. Victims of domestic violence obviously need our support, especially throughout these challenging times. And I'm proud that my office has jumped at the opportunity to help our survivors in a number of ways since the pandemic began. The pandemic led to a new hashtag, Stay Home for Nevada. The COVID pandemic and the dangers of it led to the hashtag, Stay Home for Nevada. But sometimes the dangers are in the home. And that's the reason why our offices have worked together to ensure that we can provide services. My office in particular is working now with Uber to help offer free rides to victims of domestic violence and sexual violence. And through that partnership, we worked with domestic violence shelters, Safeness as an example, throughout the state to help provide transportation services to victims in need. Before that, my office worked with Aaron's Rents and ensured the donation of nearly 500 mattresses to numerous shelters in Nevada impacted by the pandemic. And these shelters serve survivors of domestic violence and the families taking in foster care and our homeless population. And during the unprecedented time that we're in right now, we're seeing a greater incidence of domestic violence, as Mr. Drutanich has indicated. Nevada is home to many vulnerable populations, and my office is honored to receive these grants from the Department of Justice, from the Office of Violence Against Women. In the past, my office has received funding for STOP and for SASP grants, and we've been able to make these federal funds available and to distribute them to service providers, to agencies, and to law enforcement throughout the state who provide critical services for victims of domestic and sexual violence. Specifically, the Services Training Officers Prosecutors, or STOP grants, and Sexual Assault Service Providers, or SASP grants, have enhanced victim safety, and they hold offenders accountable for the crimes of intimate partner violence, of dating violence, of stalking, and of sexual assault. But beyond some of the services you may expect from these types of grants, like transportation, housing, food needs, there's also in the last year, our previously distributed STOP and STAF grants have helped Nevada agencies and organizations to create a notification system for hearings to notify victims about upcoming temporary protection orders. We've helped to develop training to educate Nevada judges who hear intimate partner violence on how to effectively identify and respond to violence against women. We're helping to recruit and maintain victim advocates with Asian language and cultural skills to help this population of victims of crime. We've also expanded collaboration between victim advocates and law enforcement, and we've provided support to individuals who are incarcerated and who have experienced sexual violence while incarcerated, just to name a few. I have no doubt that this funding will help provide critical services for our victims of crime and to our families in need. And that's because it's essential that we continue to band together to support our survivors of violent crimes. So thank you again for having me here today, and I'm proud to not only honor the victims of domestic violence, but to be a part of this statewide coalition. Thank you again, Mr. Drutanich.
The next speaker up is District Attorney Steve Wolfson. Before turning it over to Steve Wolfson, I wanted to point out not only Veronica's picture down here near the plaque of the Domestic Violence Memorial, but her name and Yvonne's name on a plaque on that wall over to my left. And with that, I'll give it to Steve Wolfson. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start off by apologizing. I've not had the privilege of meeting Rose yet. Are you Rose?
I'm Rose.
Okay, Rose. Well, it's a privilege and an honor to meet you this morning. I want to thank you for the courage you have since your daughter's death by participating with our legislature in getting laws passed that will help prosecutors and service providers and people that care about the victims of domestic violence. Your contribution is immeasurable. And thank you for your courage in being here today. This can't be easy for you. So thank you. This is exactly what law enforcement should be, what you're looking at right now, a collaborative effort between the federal government and our U.S. Attorney, Nick Drutanich, is doing a wonderful job in general and in particular with the subject of domestic violence. And on the state level, with Attorney General Aaron Ford and his office and his staff participating in so many things to help combat domestic violence and help the victims of domestic violence. And then, of course, law enforcement, the first responders, the people that actually go out and have that first contact with the victims of domestic violence, the offenders, and then Safeness, a wonderful, wonderful organization that goes out now to domestic violence crime scenes and assists victims. This is exactly what law enforcement should be, a collaborative effort the combination of resources to work together. Now, Mr. Tutanich mentioned that his office has about 30 very serious domestic violence-related cases, primarily cases involving offenders and guns, because those are the most serious cases. My office, though, receives scores of domestic violence cases each and every week. We receive misdemeanor and felony cases from North Las Vegas Police, Henderson Police, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police, and other law enforcement agencies. Now, the good news is most of those are misdemeanors, not involving serious injury or, God forbid, death. But we do also have the felonies, the strangulations, and the homicides. But the misdemeanor case of today, the punch, the push, the shove, turns into the felony homicide case tomorrow. And that's what we're here for today. The misdemeanors are important. I don't want to take away from those misdemeanors. But it's the felons, it's the abusers, the offenders that get possession of weapons. That's what we're really here about today. And that's what we are going to be targeting. Through this grant application, which I'm so honored to be able to receive, it's going to fund a prosecutor from my office that's going to work with the U.S. Attorney's Office, in addition to their own prosecutors, in targeting these most serious offenders. We need to get the message out that domestic violence is unacceptable, and that if you engage in domestic violence, there are going to be consequences. Right now, if you are convicted of domestic violence, or you have a temporary protection order in place, or other related offenses, you are prohibited from possessing a weapon, period. It's pretty straightforward. You have a domestic violence conviction, you're not allowed to possess a weapon. But too many of our offenders ignore that law, and like I said before, those cases turn into homicides. So if we can target these offenders before the violent crime occurs, that's our objective. So thank you, Mr. Tutanich, Attorney General Ford, law enforcement, Safeness, for working together towards a common goal. Thank you. Mr. Darcy?
I think it's Pat Gorman from the ATF that's going to talk.
Good morning. I'm Patrick Gorman, Special Agent in Charge for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF's San Francisco Field Division. I would first like to thank U.S. Attorney Tutanich for inviting me here today to join him and our fellow partners. Investigating domestic violence-derived firearm offenses is critically important to ATF, and we are pleased to join our partners to create a united front against domestic violence. Protecting the public is at the forefront of ATF's mission. Our special agents work hard to prevent those individuals who are prohibited from possessing firearms. This includes investigating those who illegally possess a firearm after being convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence or who are subject to a domestic violence protective order. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a troubling increase in domestic violence cases. To combat this unacceptable trend, ATF has been working side by side with our prosecutorial and law enforcement partners to achieve a maximum impact with the investigation and prosecution of those domestic violence offenders who illegally possess firearms. It is critically important to prevent these abusers from having access to firearms and to reduce the threat of gun violence in our communities. ATF is prioritizing the investigation of these offenders through a coordinated effort with our law enforcement partners. For example, when offenders are arrested for illegally possessing firearms by law enforcement agencies, such as the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department or Henderson Police Department, ATF presents these cases for federal prosecution when appropriate. I am grateful ATF is a part of these collective efforts to prevent and reduce firearm-related violent crimes that significantly impact and harm vulnerable members of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Next up is Chris Darcy.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Assistant Sheriff Chris Darcy with the Metropolitan Police Department. I'm surrounded here by a bunch of very important people, all from different agencies, and it looks like all wearing different masks today. But we're all here for the same thing. Different agencies, common purpose, and you heard District Attorney Wolfson say it a little bit earlier, it's all about collaboration. Domestic violence really impacts every person in this community. You may not see it, you may not hear it, but when it happens to you, you feel it. And when you're a victim of it, you become traumatized and you don't know where to turn. Often, hopefully, they call the police. We respond. This very building that we're standing in was our training academy back in 1991 when I went through this academy and learned about domestic violence and the laws. And I'm here to tell you it has changed significantly since then. And it will continue to change significantly as we move forward in the future. And it's programs and partnerships like this with the U.S. Attorney's Office and grant funding that will enable us to partner with the nonprofits in our community to reduce the ill effects of domestic violence. The Metropolitan Police Department realized this years ago when we started working with nonprofit organizations out there, because we don't have the capacity to do everything all the time, but together as a community, we do. And this type of funding allows us to really enhance those collaborative partnerships to where the Metropolitan Police Department, Safeness, and any other nonprofit out there to really get involved and change people's lives. Because the most important people involved in this really isn't the folks that are standing up here, it's the community, it's you, it's the media, it's the victims, and unfortunately the future victims that we know will be out there. They're the most important people. So we started and embarked upon a project called PS 417, Project Safety. And if you wonder what 417 means, that's our police code for domestic violence. So it has relevancy, right? PS 417, where when Metro police officers respond to a domestic violence call, we're able to call upon Safeness to come out because we know that what we do in those critical hours is important, but after is really important. What about the next day and the day after? And how do we get that victim the help that they truly need to get away from the batterer or the suspect, right? How do we continue that care for that person so that we don't go back out there? And we know that once we instituted this program, that 92% of the time, we didn't have a repeat call. That's an important number. I'd like to get it to 100, personally, but 92% of the time, we don't have to go back. That's success, and it's measured one life at a time. And that's what this program's gonna enable us to do. The partnerships with the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Attorney General, the District Attorney, the ATF, Metropolitan Police, Henderson, Marshals, everybody that you see standing before you and involved in this criminal justice system that we have here in the Valley is working together to ensure their safety, your safety, and using this grant funding is going to enable us to do so much more than we're able to do now. And that is the model going forward. Collaboration, working together, we're going to reduce the amount of domestic violence that we see in this Las Vegas Valley. Thank you. My mask.
Thank you. And our final speaker today is Janice Jones-Torrance, the Vice President of Crisis Services at Safeness, to talk a little bit more about 417.
Thank you, Mr. Trutanich, and all of our other law enforcement and dignitaries here for including us in Safeness and all of the advocates represented here today, coming together in support of victims. Today's announcement of the grant awards is a significant change for Safeness and other agencies as we face shortfalls and increased demand for services and support due to COVID-19. Since the beginning of this pandemic, domestic violence has risen, as you've heard our other speakers say, along with an escalation in the level of abuse. COVID has presented some unique challenges for victims, including intensified isolation and additional barriers. When you have to stay at home with your abuser, You know, where do you go? Who do you turn to? And so what we have seen is an increase in calls. And so calls to our 24/7 crisis hotline have risen by 21%. And we've seen almost double the number of clients seeking immediate shelter due to this domestic violence increase. In response, we've expanded our shelter capacity and critical programs like PS 417. Our PS 417 partnership with Metro, it exemplifies our commitment to ramp up versus scale back, right, during a time of a pandemic, expanding the program into all areas and responding to the 75% increase in Metro calls for intensified advocacy. And so you will see on the graphics here, we talk about why the increase. Okay, we talk about some of the different ways, including financial abuse, the isolation, all of those different things that victims of violence are facing right now. Some of you may be watching right now. Some of you may have family members that are going through this right now. The funds that are going to be given to this community are going to be instrumental in changing the game and amplifying services for victims of violence. When Metro goes out, our advocates are right there alongside them, right? They're there for law enforcement. Advocates are there for emotional support, to provide referrals, to provide resources, and hopefully so that that call is never repeated again. 92%, right, as Lieutenant Darcy said. And so we are, you know, even more excited about the changes that we can make. As they say, you guys, it takes a village. This is the Nevada's village. This is our village right here. And I am so honored to be a part of the solution. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. In conclusion, I want to talk about this team and this collaboration of the people up here on the stage. You've heard from many of them today, but you have not heard from Chief Andres, Chief of Henderson Police Department, and Marshal Schofield. I want to thank you for your support, your guidance, Marshal, and the work that the men and women in your department do. In addition to everyone on stage today, I also want to thank Chief Freeman in the back of the room for being here to support today, as well as the North Las Vegas Police Department and my team members that made today possible, including PSN Coordinator Allison Reese, First Assistant U.S. Attorney Chris Baker, Deputy U.S. Attorney Chris Chu, and one of the prosecutors on the case that I talked about, AUSA Melanie Smith, as well as Tricia Young, our PIO. Thank you very much. Many of us will be able to stick around for questions if you have them. Otherwise, some of us have engagements and need to depart immediately. But thank you very much for attending.
Good job.